Hello everyone and welcome to Poll 361. In this week's lecture, we will cover the fundamentals of beginning your very own research paper. In this lecture, we'll continue our conversation from week 1 on how to specify a proper research question, sources that will help you narrow and define your research topic, and then we will cover the basic structure of an academic research paper, which will help give you an idea of what you'll be doing throughout this class. Now, the material on this slide is basically a recap of what we discussed last week. The first step in the research process is identifying a topic of interest to you. And based upon the exercises from last week, I think everyone's done a really great job thinking about the topics that really interest you. So far, we've heard a lot of general interest research topics that are very suitable for this course. Some of your classmates have suggested they're interested in broad topics such as suicide rates among veterans, voter turnout in 2020, or incarceration rates in the United States. Once you've identified the topic you're interested in, the next step is to narrow your question with a proper frame. Recall what we discussed last week. Proper research questions include a unit of analysis and a dependent variable. The unit of analysis refers to the entity or level at which each observation is made, and the dependent variable refers to the main topic of interest. Now, again, I don't know how much of these are new terms to everyone, and they might be a little bit too difficult to distinguish between at first, but I promise with practice, you will get the hang of it. So I want to look at an example data set to help us distinguish between the unit of analysis and the dependent variable. So here's a data set from the paper we'll be reading in a few weeks, I think in week 5, when we talk about measurement. In this specific paper, I was interested in analyzing why some states allowed the concealed carry of firearms on college campuses and why some states ban concealed carry on college campuses. So the first question I want to ask y'all is, what is the unit of analysis in this paper? And you should be able to determine that based upon the research question itself. But looking at how the data set is structured can also tell us what the unit of analysis is. Remember, the easiest way to identify the unit of analysis is simply by looking at the rows in the data set. The unit of analysis is the level or entity at which observations are made. Now, if you need to, go ahead and pause the video for a moment, look over the data set, think about the research question, and I want you to try and guess what the unit of analysis is here. As you can see, each of the rows represent data collected for every state. So in this research paper, the unit of analysis is the state. It is the entity by which observations are made. Columns, on the other hand, represent our variables. They are the things or the topics that we're interested in studying. So just remember, this will be very helpful for the midterm exam. Rows equal the unit of analysis, or your unique observations, and the columns equal variables, or your topics. So when I'm building a data set, I always like the dependent variable, or the thing that I'm interested in studying, to be the very first variable in the data set. And that's totally based on preference, and you don't have to follow that necessarily, but when you begin building your data set, I'd recommend following this format just for the sake of consistency. I think that will be helpful. Okay, so remember my research question here is, why do some states allow concealed carry of firearms on college campuses? And the variable here, the very first one, represents my dependent variable, the thing that I'm interested in studying. And you can see that represented here with these different measurements for each type of law in each state. So more information will be provided in a moment about how we got this variable and why it's coded this way, but what I really want you to take away here from this slide specifically is how we identify the unit of analysis, measured in the rows, and our variables, measured in the columns. Now, based upon the course survey, I don't think anyone is interested in performing analyses about political phenomenon in different countries. So I think that most, if not all of you, we'll have a data set that's very similar to the one that I just showed you, with the 50 states as the unit of analysis. And if you're interested in public opinion data, which we'll look at later in the semester, and you want to analyze the individual behavior or attitudes of people, then your unit of analysis, of course, will be the individual person. Or if you think that you'll be using a different unit of analysis completely, just be sure to write a note in the discussion board in this week's module so I can make sure that that is the case and that you've got everything that you need to proceed with that research paper. Eventually, your data set will expand to include other variables that you think cause or influence the main thing that you are interested in studying. These are referred to as independent variables. And don't worry, all of this is going to be covered in a lot of detail next week, but I just want to introduce you to these terms early so you can start getting familiar with the terminology. So let's do a quick recap before we move on. The unit of analysis is the level or the entity at which observations are made. So think like counties, states, individual persons, things like that. The dependent variable is the thing or the topic that you are interested in studying. And your independent variables, also known as explanatory variables, are the things that explain the dependent variable. And we're going to go over some examples throughout this lecture, but I just want to get you familiar and comfortable with these terms early. Now, ultimately, your research paper will grow to include these two characteristics, independent variables and directionality. We have a whole week on directionality. I think that's actually next week with hypotheses. So no need to worry about those right now, but just keep that in mind. These your independent variables and the directionality of how they impact the dependent variable, those become your hypotheses. And you'll learn various research techniques throughout the semester to determine whether or not there is a statistical relationship between your dependent variable and the things that you think cause or influence that variable. Again, I'm not expecting you guys to have this all figured out at this point, but just keep in mind that this is where we're headed. So let's return briefly to the GUNS data set to look at the difference between an independent variable and a dependent variable. The heart of data analysis really boils down to cause and effect. We refer to this as causality. Again, here the research question is, why do some states allow concealed carry on college campuses while other states do not? Well, let's think about why a state legislature would deem it necessary to pass such a law in the first place. What is the reasoning behind allowing students and faculty to carry weapons on campus? Is it fundamentally a safety issue? Might we expect places with a lot of gun murders to think that campuses would be safer if everyone was also allowed to carry a gun and protect themselves? I mean, this is generally the argument that you hear made by many politicians who support these policies. And then we start thinking to ourselves, well, maybe we can get data on the number of gun murders in each state and see if that, is correlated in any way or has any impact on whether or not a state allows concealed carry on college campuses, right? And then we get into the hypothesis, perhaps states with more gun murders might be more likely to allow concealed carry on college campuses. And that's exactly what I did here in this research paper with this variable here, gun murders. I was able to find data on the number of gun murders in a given state on the FBI's crime statistics website, I think, and I included that in my data set as an independent variable, an explanatory variable to explain my dependent variable, concealed carry laws. Okay, so I hope that that makes sense and you found this example helpful. As always, if you have any questions about the lecture, just make sure to post those in the weekly discussion board. So overall, these are the things that I want you to start thinking about when you're formulating your research question. What is the topic that you want to study? And later down the road, what are the things that you think cause or influence that phenomenon? Okay, on to the next stage. So once you've identified a primary research question or political phenomenon that you're interested in analyzing, the next step, which will be the primary focus of our Thursday meeting, is to determine whether or not the thing that you're interested in studying, your dependent variable, is it observable? So generally what this means is that once you've identified your research question, the next step is asking yourself, is data available on this topic? So the goal here is to find spreadsheets of data relating to your topic. This is going to be the crux of your research project in this class. And let's keep using the example of concealed carry laws. So back in 2017, like we discussed in week 1, I noticed that it was becoming more and more common that states were adopting these laws and allowing faculty and students to carry concealed weapons on college campuses. And I wanted to understand, why was this happening? So remember, this is an example of an inductive research process, beginning with a specific observation and trying to extrapolate to a broad generalization. So in order to determine if this was a viable research project, I had to look into whether or not someone had observed the different concealed carry laws in each state. After a few Google searches, I came across a website called Armed Campuses, which tracks concealed carry legislation in every single state. So I was very grateful to find this resource. And for my public law students in the class, you'll know that state laws can vary dramatically from state to state. So I was rather delighted when I found that this website had already done a lot of that heavy lifting by categorizing each state law on concealed carry into different easily understandable categories for me. And voila, this is the data source for my research paper. Armed Campuses identified 5 distinct types of concealed carry laws. And so I created an Excel spreadsheet and began entering the data from Armed Campuses for each state row by row in my data set. And this is exactly the process that you'll be following throughout the course. In Thursday's class, you'll be searching for data sets, just like this process that I walked you through, and that's going to help you write your research paper. So the primary goal of Thursday's class is determining whether or not data exists for the specific research paper that you want to investigate. Let's do a couple more examples. Last week in class, a student mentioned that they were interested in studying veteran suicide rates. Well, we have to ask ourselves, is data available on the topic? And yes, with relative ease, we went to the Veterans Affairs website and we were able to find observations from 2015 to 2018 at the state level. Notice the data is also very nuanced and it contains data for both men and women, which allows us to investigate the topic at a very specific level if we wish. If we wanted to incorporate a gendered aspect into our research paper, we have the ability to do that because the data is that detailed. So as we progress throughout the semester, you'll start asking yourself, what factors might explain my dependent variable? Remember, these are the independent variables. In the case of veteran suicide, we might hypothesize that access to VA facilities or how much the VA in each state spends on medical care or education, it might influence these statistics, right? And the VA, fortunately, has very, very meticulous reports that document access to facilities and budgetary expenditures for every single state. So here's just the report on the state of Wisconsin, for example. And this is exactly the type of information that we want to collect for each state as independent variables in our research papers. Okay, so you don't have to start coding data yet or start looking for data sources for independent variables, but just want to give you an idea. This is where the class is going. Let me know, again, in the discussion board if any of this is confusing or if you need clarification, okay? Another student expressed interest in analyzing incarceration rates in the United States. So what's the first step? Ask ourselves, is data available? Absolutely it is. This is a very well-researched topic. Sentencingproject.org has compiled a significant number of reports using data collected by the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics. And once you really start digging into the data, you find all sorts of statistics to incorporate into your data sets. Here, for example, we're able to find a very detailed data set on prison population, jail population, percentage of prison population serving a life sentence. We've got statistics by gender, race, age. So depending on what type of data is available, that might significantly change the scope of your research question. You might come across a specific variable in a data set and say, oh my God, I didn't know that, they coded this type of stuff. I think that I really want to focus my research question on this thing specifically. And that's an excellent thing to happen when you're involved in this beginning the research process stage. So just keep those things in mind. Now, on the other hand, sometimes data is not always available for the specific research question that we want to ask, and I wanted to give you a quick example of that. In a paper that I recently collaborated on, this is the one that we discussed in class last week, we were interested in studying why gun sales skyrocketed during the Obama presidency. However, there is no national registry that collects data on the raw number of guns sold in each state. It just doesn't exist. There are no empirical observations on that level. So instead, what we had to do was get creative. Now we know that the FBI does collect data on the number of background checks that are processed in each state for every month when someone wants to purchase a firearm. And while it's not a perfect measurement of gun purchases in every state, it's a close approximation. We call these proxy measurements that we used for this specific research question. So sometimes you just have to be creative, okay? So you may run into these problems, you might not, but there's always a workaround. So again, this is the purpose of Thursday's class. Start looking for data sets that you're gonna build your research paper upon. And if you run into any problems, we're gonna work them out together in class. So at any rate, this is the overview of how to determine whether or not empirical observations exist for the research paper that you want to write. Again, please be sure to share your research question in this week's discussion board. Sometime on Tuesday, if you can, I'd like to have enough time to look at your responses and prepare. That'll help me direct you to specific databases in our Thursday meeting. So try to do that sometime Tuesday afternoon, if you can. All right. The last thing that I want to talk about is how to structure a research paper. Everyone's research paper will consist of 5 distinct section headings. You've got the introduction, a review of the literature, description of the data and the methods that were used in the paper, a presentation of your findings, and then finally, a conclusion. So for now, I'd like you to just focus on the first 2 sections. I'm certainly not expecting you to start writing your research papers this week, but I will want to have periodic check-in meetings with you just to make sure that you're progressing throughout the semester and that you're getting those sections written and that everything is good to go. And keep in mind, I am always happy to look over anything that you'd like feedback on, so just send me drafts whenever you'd like. I'm always happy to look at those. Okay, so the introduction is pretty self-explanatory, right? In a few pages, you'll discuss your research question, why it's important to study, and give the reader an idea of what you'll be doing in the paper. Where's the paper headed? We call this the roadmap of the paper. The literature review is an extremely important component of the research paper. Essentially, this section examines what pre-existing research has been done on your topic. So throughout the semester, when we are, analyzing specific research articles in political science, we're going to break these down. So you're going to read all the sections of the paper. We'll talk about the point of the main points being made in the introduction. How is the literature review written? Let's kind of summarize what's going on there. the data and the methods, all of that. So the purpose of those assignments, having you analyze peer-reviewed academic research articles, is to give you an idea of what this research looks like and give you an opportunity or, an example for you to model your own research papers upon. Thursday, we're going to work collectively to start finding research articles for you to include in your literature review. So we'll be doing both data and literature reviews. If you recall from the homework journal assignment that was distributed last week, I've got 2 specific exercises to get you working on your literature review. The first one is that you have to find 5 academic journals that you think will be useful in writing your literature review. So let me just give you an example of how this exercise would work. If you navigate to the Murphy Library page, you can limit your search to just journals specifically. And say that you were interested in studying prison populations in the United States. So if you just type prison in the search bar, you will see a list of journals that exclusively publish articles just on the topic of prisons. So we've got, when we execute that search, we've got the Prison Journal, we've got the International Journal of Prisoner Health, we've got, what do we got here? We got the Journal of Prison Education and Reentry, right? We've got all these different journals that exclusively publish articles on this topic. So this is always a really great place to start when you're getting ready to conduct your literature review. Just look at what types of journals exclusively publish on the topic that you're interested in. And what you'll want to do is, click on these journals and see what types of articles they publish, and you might be surprised. You might find the perfect article in one of these journals that really helps get that research process moving. So generally, just searching for the journals and the types of articles that are being published in the journals, this can really help you think of a research question if you're still a little bit undecided about what you want to study. So that's part of the homework journal, just finding journals that you think will be helpful in writing your research paper. And then the second part of the homework journal has you list specific articles from those journals and write out those full citations. So if let's say that we've got a little bit stronger idea of what exactly we want to write our research paper on. Say we want to write about solitary confinement in the United States. Well, instead of searching for journals, let's search specifically for articles and make sure that you click peer-reviewed because we only want to be examining academic peer-reviewed journals for our research paper. We'll talk more about the importance of peer review, I think next week or the week after. At any rate, so we would type in solitary confinement in the United States and we would look for articles. And then we find, all kinds of different articles. We've got public health and solitary confinement in the United States. What's really important here is to look at the journal. Okay, this is published in the American Journal of Public Health. Got it. Let's move on to the next article. We've got psychological distress in solitary confinement. Okay, that sounds interesting. Oh, look, it's the same journal, American Journal of Public Health. All right, well, I might want to list that, on the journal section of my homework journal, because it seems like a lot of the things that I'm interested in are all being published in the American Journal of Public Health. So keep that kind of stuff in mind. We can keep scrolling down. What do we got? Constraining the legality of solitary confinement. Okay, that's published in the American Journal of Criminal Justice. So you might want to check out that journal specifically to see what type of things that they're publishing. And just keep scrolling down. Look at what the articles are, what the topics are, the journal that they're being published in, and that should really get the wheels moving for you on, finding those sources that are really going to help you write your literature review, get an idea of what people have written about, what they've already written about. And a great thing about these articles is that at the very end, there's usually a section in the conclusion that discusses avenues for future research. So oftentimes it's the the author's responsibility to talk about the shortcomings of the literature or areas regarding the topic that haven't yet been explored. And you might surprise yourself and find a really interesting and manageable, viable, feasible research question in the conclusion of one of these journal articles. So just don't forget to use the full citation in the homework journal when you're talking about sources that you think you might use or you plan on using in your research paper. You can just click on the quotations here. These are in APA. I would prefer you guys to use MLA, so you can just click on MLA. And there we go. You can just copy and paste that citation right into your homework journal assignment. All right, so I hope that is helpful. If you don't have experience, doing academic literature reviews, this is just how we're going to go about finding your sources and getting familiar with the literature. Also, Google Scholar. I find Google Scholar generally has a ton more articles. Don't let the UWL library hear me say that, but they're usually way easier to access. Sometimes our library only has subscriptions to certain journals, so you might not be able to access an article that looks really interesting. So just remember, either use the UWL library website or go to googlescholar.com and use that as your search engine for finding research articles. Again, we're going to be doing all of this together in class on Thursday, so just be sure to bring your questions. Let's go ahead and end with a recap here. Today we talked about developing your research question, making sure that includes a unit of analysis and a dependent variable, so your research question is super crystal clear. We talked about finding empirical observations on your topic. So again, part of the homework journal is listing databases that you plan on using for your research paper. And then lastly, we talked about familiarizing yourself with the research paper structure. So start thinking about your introduction, start looking for sources to include in your literature review, and those are the main objectives for this week. Don't forget to bring your homework journal assignments to class on Thursday. We're going to be working on those together. Don't forget to post your research questions. Hopefully you've had a little bit more time to think about those and narrow those down a little bit. Please post those in the discussion board at your earliest convenience so I can get working on those with you guys. And that's it for this week's lecture. I hope you guys have an excellent week, and I look forward to seeing you on Thursday.